Good morning, everybody. Welcome to EMPA's webinar for August. I hope you can all hear me okay, and I'm sure there's a few still logging in, but we've only got an hour, so we will get started. Excellent. I see a thumbs up from someone, so I'll take that as consent to continue. In the spirit of reconciliation, EMPA recognises the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and the communities of the many diverse peoples across the country and the world with their continuing connection to land, place, waters and culture. We respectfully acknowledge and honour all Indigenous communities, past, present and future, and are grateful for their vibrant and ongoing presence. Very warm welcome to you all. My name is Jeremy Hillman. I am the co-chair of EMPA, and on behalf of EMPA, really glad to have you online today for another exciting webinar. I think there's about 188 or so of you registered, and look forward to hearing your questions and engaging with our eminent person, Mark Crossweller, today. Before we get into it, just quickly, if you have attended an EMPA webinar before or used Zoom, you should be familiar with the controls. If you're new to it, please jump on the chat panel at any time. It's a good idea to open that up and chat to your fellow participants. Just make sure you've got chat with everyone selected so you can see. Also, there's a Q&A button, which we ask you to use for questions that you'd like to ask Mark. So please pop it in there and we'll feed those questions in as we go. If we don't get a chance to answer them all, we'll also try to come back to you afterwards. If you've got any issues and questions or can't access the chat, you can email webinars@hpe.com.au and they're online at the moment and will assist. But launching now into the webinar itself, and it is based on a newly released, hot off the press book called Compassion in Disaster Management. I've got my own copy right here in front of me. Compassion in Disaster Management, the Essential Ethic of Relational Leadership. Mark Crossweller, the author, has 40 years of experience in crisis, national security and emergency management, leading major strategic reform in governance, strategy, policy, operations and capability. From 2012 to 2020, Mark was the Director General of Emergency Management Australia, which is now known as NEMA, and he was head of the National Resilience Task Force. Mark was responsible for briefing the Prime Minister and Cabinet on disaster management and providing strategic policy advice on climate and disaster risk reduction and resilience. Mark is now the founder and director of Ethical Intelligence. He's a senior advisor and luminary to KPMG, advising on disaster management, resilience and leadership ethics. He's a distinguished advisor to the National Security College at Australian National University, and of course, now published author. Mark's ongoing research interest is in relational leadership ethics in senior executive leadership within the private, public sectors and national security and disaster management sectors. And the essential question he asks as a driver of this book is, should leadership minimise suffering? And drawing on his own experiences as a disaster management specialist, along with high-level interviews with disaster management leaders from across the USA, Australia and New Zealand, Mark's new book emphatically argues, yes, that it should. Mark bridges theory and practice to produce an essential text for aspiring and experienced leaders of all types, and he offers us in disaster management ways to improve our ability to lead, serve and protect others during disasters and crises. So a very warm welcome to our distinguished guest, Mark. Let's get started. Mark, could you briefly describe for us the journey that you've been on to write this book?
Yeah, good morning, Jeremy, and good morning, colleagues who are online and listening. It's been a long time coming, I think, probably 40 years since I started in the Rural Fire Service in 1985. So January next year is 40 years I've been in the sector. I think I've had an end-to-end experience from literally the end of the hose to the office of a Prime Minister. And I don't profess to be an expert, but I've had a lived experience of the system in full. And I think as you get towards the end of your career, there's just burning questions that don't leave you. There's just, I think you sort of see the sector in a very warm-hearted way because it's such a big part of your life. But I think you become to know it intimately. And I think part of that intimate knowing or understanding of the sector is understanding what's missing, or some of the things that may well be missing. And it's probably missing in ourselves as authors and leaders, but it's also missing in the sector more broadly. So I had burning questions about where the sector was going systemically in relation to how it was relating to citizens and communities. And it bothered me enormously that there seemed to be a big gap there, seemed to be a growing chasm between governments and their leadership and their institutions and citizens, and what citizens were needing and what we were providing. And I think that's what really drove me to do the research. And I started my PhD in 2014 and finished it 3 years ago. The book is the culmination of that research plus other research that happened since then. So it's a personal, professional, academic reflection, Jeremy, on what I think would bring out the best of us. I think what is the best of us as a collective sector, our capacity to be trustworthy and compassionate, but also highlighting in the book what stops us from being that way and being more mindful of that so that we can navigate past those blockages and those complexities to be more of who we already are. There's no doubt that the sector has a very strong ethic towards being trusted and compassionate, and I don't doubt that for a second. But citizens can't always see it, and they don't always feel it. And I think that sort of indicates to me that there's something that's missing in the way we see the world and the way we interact with the world, and more importantly for this audience, I guess, the way we communicate with it. So that's the journey, essentially, Jeremy, and it's a proposition. It's founded in philosophy and political science and other academic disciplines in order to give the argument some rigor, but it's also based on lived experience of 90 leaders across 3 countries, and then my own lived experience as well. So I argue it's rigorous. It may not be, and I argue it's compelling. Not everybody may agree with it, but that's the world of academia. But at least it's one puts one's money where one's mouth is, and puts forward a proposition for people to think about, talk about, and reflect upon.
Thanks, Mark. That's a great, a very great description of a many years journey for you. I'm just wondering, in terms of definitionally, if we could maybe pull apart compassion. I mean, to me, I sort of think empathy with compassion, but I know you mean something a bit different potentially.
Yeah, I think empathy is a feeling state, which is really important. But compassion, it does a number of things. We recognise suffering in self and other. So we have to actually recognise that suffering exists, and that it exists in everybody in all circumstances. It's kind of pervasive and never leaves our life, unless we bring another attribute such as compassion to the situation. But so it is about feeling empathy. So engaging in seeing, sensing, and feeling the suffering of another, and engaging in that emotionality. So we're moved by the circumstances of another. But it's more than being moved by, which is what empathy does. Compassion leads us to action. So we have to actually do something about the suffering that we see. And as part of that action, we might have to tolerate uncomfortable feelings about the people that we're showing compassion towards. So it's really easy to be compassionate to our kids, well, most of the time. Sometimes they can be a bit annoying, but it's really easy to be compassionate to those people we love and like and are close to and are similar to us in terms of age or gender or culture or ethnicity or whatever description we want to give them. It's not so easy to be compassionate to people we don't like. But being leaders in institutions and it being in the public sphere, we have to be compassionate to people that we don't like as well as people that we do like. So we've got to be in action, Jeremy. We've got to actually do something about the suffering that's presenting. And my argument in the book is that because leaders right throughout the system have varying levels of access to the equities of power, wealth, and resource. So if you're in institutional life, you're trading those equities or you're operating through those equities constantly on behalf of citizens. So you've got more access, greater access to those things and greater access to political leaders who make the big decisions. You have more access to them than citizens do, generally speaking. So it's important that we understand those equities of power, wealth, and resource, money, legislation, resources, people, equipment, technologies, all that sort of stuff, and what are we using them for? What's the prime obligation of a government in dispensing of those equities? It's really to do 3 things. It's to promote the happiness of the citizen, the wellness of the citizen, and the capacity for the citizen to flourish. and that is the wish of every human being. That is the premise or the basis of Western liberal democracies, and why governments exist to give us the opportunity or create the circumstances that we otherwise could not create for ourselves, to be happy, to be well, and to flourish. And in other words, to also minimise suffering. So take suffering out of the equation or minimise it in the system, such that people can be happy, well, and flourishing. So they can exercise their agency, Jeremy, essentially, so they've got capacity for free will and choice. And if we understand that as the basis of why governments exist and why we exist within the governments to help facilitate that, then the way we communicate, the way we act, the way we respond, the way we advise, the way we set up frameworks should be predicated upon those attributes. And this is really brought to the fore by one particular Australian government minister, who said pretty much that if governments weren't there to facilitate and provide the circumstances and the environments socially, culturally, and economically for people to be happy and to be well and to flourish, if governments weren't there to do that, then what were they there for? And it's an existential question. I think it's a really important question, that we get back to those principles of Western liberal democracy, and that's why governments exist, is to give people maximum opportunity to be happy, well, and flourish. And I think we participate in that in extraordinarily complex ways. But and at the heart of that is being compassionate, is seeing the suffering of those, seeing what block gets in the way of people being happy and well, and to the extent at which we are able, doing something about it.
What would you say to people who might ask about compassion fatigue? A lot of us, obviously working in very intense parts of emergency management, might be worried about that overreach, or how that might paralyze or impact our work. Have you got any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I talk about that in the book. And I think it's if we can't be compassionate to ourselves, then it's very difficult to be compassionate to others. And I've seen this. I mean, I've had the same experience throughout the 40 years of my career, I guess. They're still learning it too. How do you be compassionate towards yourself at the same time as being compassionate towards other people? So we really have to see, and I talk about this in the book, but we really have to see the suffering in ourselves and be prepared to do something about that as well. So it's a shared space. There's no point being self to the point of losing our mental health or physical health. That's not wise. There's no wisdom in that at all. So really, all compassion asks us to do is to do whatever we reasonably can do to alleviate the suffering of another. And sometimes life will call us to be unreasonable. We're going to have to really stretch ourselves. We're going to have to be venturous in our pursuit of compassion, and we're going to have to take a great risk or an arduous journey in order to help somebody else. And we've seen that play out in disaster grounds, in fires, in floods, in storms, in cyclones. People really stretching themselves, citizens and emergency services personnel, stretching themselves beyond their capacity or limits to help another person. That they are rare circumstances, and in most circumstances, Jeremy, we don't need to go that far. So I think I often talk about the ethics that align with compassion is courage and wisdom, and just use our wisdom to work out what can we reasonably do here, and what is in fact unreasonable and uncalled for. So the thing, the philosophy talks a lot about this, but suffering in itself is impermanent. It doesn't hang around forever. Something we feel as though it hangs around forever because that's the way our mind sees the world, but it actually alleviates itself in time anyway. Our role as sentient beings, as human beings, is to make an active contribution to its alleviation. But we don't have to take it all on. We don't have to do everything. We don't have to be the hero in the traditional understanding of the term. We can just be enough and do enough to protect ourselves and to consider the needs of others in the process.
Thanks, Mark. That's great. We just had a question come up in Q&A, and I remind all of you online, please pump comments and questions in there, and we'll bring them up as we go. Barb has just asked, regarding the national leadership framework that you've proposed, what steps are needed in an Australian context to work with this framework, and where are we already in terms of progress towards good practice outlined? If you could maybe just touch on the framework for those who haven't had a chance to see it.
Yeah, of course. So what I argue is that inside our systems, because we've got a propensity to be invulnerable. So our systems are invulnerable. Well, they're not really. They're actually quite vulnerable, but we pretend they're invulnerable. And our leadership can be invulnerable. So it has an invulnerable narrative. And that drives insensitivity, insufficiency, compliance, and defensiveness. So that's one side of the equation. So we're insensitive to the suffering and vulnerability of another. We're therefore necessarily insufficient in our response. We tend to be compliant with our regimes of doctrinal frameworks and policies and processes and regulation and legislation. We tend to hide behind them, particularly when things get tough, and we get defensive when criticised. The other end of the framework is a relational aspect. So we can relate to the suffering of another. So we step into the space and the needs of another human or non-human. We move to commitment to doing something about it. So we're moved by the suffering. We commit to doing something about it. We need to be venturous about how we do that. So we need to take a great journey, or maybe take great risk, and that could be pushing against tides of uncertainty and pushing against regulatory regimes within our institutions, as an example. But we still need to be held to account for action. So if you think about it, being insensitive, insufficient, compliant, and defensive is in some respects sometimes easier, because we can just hide behind that and just get on with the job and do the best we can and not worry too much about anything else. It's easier, but the more rewarding aspect is to be relatable, committed, venturous, and accountable. And when I put those contrasts up in front of leaders, when I teach this stuff at the National Security College and elsewhere, people say what's better, what's more rewarding is to be relatable, but what's easier is to be invulnerable, is to be insensitive, because it doesn't stretch us too far, stretches too hard. So it's very much a personal disposition. And I talk in the book about character ethics, about this is character based. So, to Barb's point, in her question, we operate in an ethical context in a very utilitarian way in our institutions. So the greatest good for the greatest number, cost benefit analysis. That's a typical ethical framing for governments to navigate, because they've got to speak to the masses and deal with the masses and govern for the masses. So a utilitarian approach is pretty reasonable. We have duties and obligations. It's a very Kantian frame. So our regulation puts duties upon us and imperatives in order to act in a certain way, to comply with the wishes of the government of the day, and so goes on. That's also perfectly reasonable. But what really counts is the character of the leader. And the reason that counts, Jeremy, is because it's character that contextualizes the ethic into the space. So we're very much place-driven in disaster management. So it's very much about community. And in order to be about community, you've got to take these universal principles that governments establish in their resilience policies and their risk reduction frameworks and all sorts of other frameworks that governments necessarily construct, and then contextualize it into the circumstances that a community finds itself. And that pathway, from a leadership perspective, is very character driven. So the leader has to understand the specific circumstances and context in which the community or citizens find themselves, and then navigate a pathway to execute that ethic or execute that framework. So if you've got a leader that's compassionate, kind, considerate, patient, understanding, it has integrity, is truthful, is trustworthy, then you're cutting a pathway into securing a relationality with that citizen or that community in order to find the mutual benefit, find the mutual pathway of solution. But if you've got a leader that's arrogant, insensitive, can't see the suffering of another, is invulnerable, is insufficient in their response, is more self-interested than interested in other people, you're not going to get that pathway. It's not going to happen. So you can have this utilitarian framework from the government about resilience policy X says communities should do Y and Z. But if you've got an insensitive leader who doesn't know how to contextualize it, doesn't know how to relate to community and put it in place, it isn't going to work. And so what my book argues is that the frameworks are important at the government level. There's nothing wrong with them fundamentally, but how do you contextualize them, and how do you bring them into the space such that a leader can help to make that framework relatable to the citizens in which they're trying to serve and protect? That's the challenge. And what I see in the system and I see in leadership is some people are really good at doing that and some people are not. And part of the reason for writing the book was to say to people, look, here is a pathway in. Here is a way of understanding and contextualizing your character and what's important about your character, such that you can get that pathway into community.
Great, thank you. What do we do in that case, Mark? I imagine there's some people listening who think, well, I don't have a boss or a leadership around me that necessarily exemplifies some of that. How do we as the comms and engagement professionals in the room help to do that when we may not have leaders with that mindset.
Yeah, that's what makes ethics so difficult. I think that some lead, and this question comes up every time I lecture on this and teach on it and speak on it. In order to exemplify what the best of us in a character context, we need top cover. So the leader one step above us, it's really important they give us permission and give us cover, and they exemplify the ethics that they wish to see in us. It's really important that that happens. Further up the chain, it's not quite so important. You can go up. You're not going to change the commissioner or the CEO or the minister fundamentally. You're not going to change their character. So that's why it takes such courage and wisdom to be this way. But you can exemplify, and exemplification is contagious. It's not so much about what you say, it's what you do. So it goes to the question of integrity. Words and actions line up. When you're being a certain way, without necessarily stating that's the way you're being, but you're being a certain way, it is infectious. People will take the lead from that. The people that you lead will take that as an exemplification, will take the signal, and are more likely to move down a similar pathway to the pathway that you're taking. So there needs to be courage in this, Jeremy. There's no doubt about it. It's not an easy framing. A lot of people say, I don't have the courage to do that. I don't have the top cover. And I think that's fine. It's practical wisdom of lived experience, which I talk a lot about in the book, will tell you when it's okay to be that way and when it's not okay to be that way. And we're just going to have to live with that. So you can't impose an ethic upon a leader 3 steps above you in order for you to be a certain way. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. This is a progressive change. This is one step at a time, one person at a time, moving in a direction that hopefully changes culture over time. It's not a quick fix. It was never going to be a quick fix. I asked the Departmental Secretary the other day, what stops virtue? What stops people being more compassionate and considerate and truthful and trustworthy and so on and so forth? And she said, I'll give you one word. She said, ego. And I said, yeah, that's pretty much it. So when you got a leader that's highly egotistical and self-interested and self-important, then you're really butting up against it. But sometimes they're so absorbed in their world that they won't notice what you're doing anyway. I know that might sound a bit counterintuitive, but if you want to be a certain way, don't sell your soul, be the way you want to be and exemplify it through practice and see what happens. Take the risk, take the journey, be venturous and see what happens. I bet you anything you like, it won't be as bad as you think. It's fear that stops us. It's not the lived experience that stops us. It's the fear that stops us, which is why compassion needs courage and compassion needs wisdom. What has our lived experience taught us about being this way? What are the great bodies of knowledge have to say about it? That's the theoretical side. And how much courage do we have to step into that realm? That's the journey of the hero, Jeremy. That's the journey we take pretty much every day. And the hero's journey is the journey of compassion. It's not the journey of ego. Joseph Campbell wrote extensively about this in his work between 1947 and 1985. You find Campbell's work influenced in Star Wars for all the Star Wars fans online today. It's the shifting of consciousness from self to other. It's to take great risk in order to address the perils that somebody else is going through. And that's what this sector does. It does it every day, metaphorically and literally. If we reframe it from being an egotistical journey to being a journey of soul, a journey of compassion, a journey of transition from self to other in terms of consciousness, then we're on the right path. And that might be one small step, or it could be 10 giant leaps. It depends on the context. But if we're mindful of that direction, then we're on the right path to making this an even more compassionate sector than it is at the moment, and establishing a closer relationship with the people we've been asked to lead, serve, and protect.
Great, thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. We've had a question from Donovan pop up in the Q&A. I'll read it out. Mark, political drivers are at times not in sync with community needs or people's need to be happy and well and flourishing. Emergency managers sometimes find themselves caught in this conflict with ethical challenges, COVID-19 being a great example of this. Do you have any ground rules or advice that you can share with us to navigate this area of tension?
No, I can use a lived experience. I guess when I was head of task force, we did the National Risk Reduction Framework, and we did Australia's vulnerability profile. And we did some advice on data management, and we did some advice on decision making in climate change, and particularly the advice that went to government on the first two policy issues referenced climate change specifically, and it was referenced in the context of a Conservative government at the time. And I remember the bureaucratic system said you have to take those references to climate change out of your advice. And I said, no, not happening. We've taken the insights from the Bureau of Meteorology and the CSIRO and other reputable scientific organisations. The government needs to know about this. We think we've politically contextualised it correctly. The advice needs to stay. And the government took the advice unchallenged. And so leadership needs courage sometimes to contest the frameworks within the political system. And again, personally, I used to hear this a lot when I was Director General particularly. People would say, my minister will never agree with that. And having briefed ministers since 1998, you get a sense of what ministers will and won't accept or agree to. And usually if it's common sense and it's logical and they can sell it, they'll actually agree to it. And I would say to some of these people, have you met your minister? And they would say, well, no, but I know my minister won't agree. And I'd say, well, how do you know? And what they were talking through was speaking through fear and speaking through supposition. So there's a big difference between cannot and will not. And something that cannot happen is probably because nature prevents it, or the law prevents it, or something prevents it which cannot be, which is insurmountable. But most of the time, what doesn't happen is not cannot, it's will not. There's no will. There's no will in the system to make the change. It's not that it can't happen, it's just that there's no will for it to happen. So we've got to really stop and think about what is it that stops us from being a different way or a certain way? Is it because we can't, or is it because we won't? And if it's to do with will, then that's a human thing. That's something we've got to navigate and we've got to contest and push against. So again, we're pushing into the space of courage, is to contest some of these frames of reference, to contest some of these ideas and these what's called institutional habitus. I'll give another example. I did some work through KPMG for a frontline organisation a few months ago, and we were briefed by one of the really nice person, briefed in the context of the scope of work, and they'd been in the system for 2 years. But what came out of their mouth was 40 years of rhetoric, 40 years of why things couldn't be done a certain way. And I know it's 40 years of rhetoric because I've been in the system for 40 years. And I've been hearing these arguments over and over and over, and I still cannot convince myself that they're valid, that there are valid reasons for not making change. They're valid reasons for not doing things differently. So we're a conservative lot. We're a conservative culture. We like the way we do things. We don't like a lot of change, and maybe that works against us. So the institutional habitus, which I talk about in the book, can be really problematic. Needs leaders with the courage to speak against it. See, often what happens when you speak against something, the first time people will laugh at you, the second time they'll get angry, the third time they'll own it as if it's their own. And that's the pathway to contesting ideas. So we have to be prepared to be ridiculed in some way, shape or form, got angry at some way, shape or form, and then have to surrender the idea to people who think it was theirs to start with. And that's when you know you've been successful.
And just on the leadership side, I know a lot of we'll have a very mixed amount of people in the room, but those of them might be thinking, well, I'm not in a leadership position in my organisation, so how is this relevant to me? Maybe if you could flesh out the leadership that you're talking about there.
Yeah, of course. I take. I mean, I'm a Buddhist philosopher. I'm going to put that out there because I say it in the book. But every thought, word, and action matters. You create your world through your language. You create the mind creates the world, and you'd be astounded at how much you can influence your world by the way you think, speak, and act. And if you think it doesn't matter, then it probably won't. But if you think that it does, then I'm sure it will, if that makes sense. So people listen. Leaders need advice. Leaders listen to followers. Leaders listen to their people. Good leaders do, at least. Arrogant leaders probably not quite so, but anyway, that's a different story. But good leaders actually listen to people. I'll be straight up about it. You know, I would know bugger all if it wasn't for good people around me my whole career. By drawing on their experiences, their insights, their comments, their wisdom, their personal stories. That's where I got my knowledge from. I got my knowledge from university as well. I got it from my own lived experience, but boy, did I get it from the conversations of other people and their lived experiences. And many of those people had no institutional standing at all, but they were smart people. They were wise in their own way. They had insights, and that some of them didn't want to be leaders, not interested, didn't want the hassle, didn't want the pressure, didn't want the stress and the anxiety of navigating institutional politics and all that comes with it. Because let's face it, the higher you go up in these systems, the more brutal it becomes. And it is brutal at the top. It's all about power. It's all about access to power and influence, and so it goes on. They're not pretty spaces. And some people look at that and say, I don't want a bar of it. But that doesn't mean they're not wise people. So if you're in the system and you either do not aspire or you're not there yet, don't think that your thoughts, words, and actions don't matter, because they do, because they shape the world. They absolutely shape the world.
Thank you. That's good advice. There's a couple more questions popping up in the Q&A. We've got one from Juliet Gibbons. Do you have any specific examples of a compassion-led recovery from emergency events, either in New Zealand or Australia, that could assist with making a case for this approach?
I think there's a plethora of examples. I always go back to, and it's at the macro level, but Anna Bligh in 10/11, I remember I was up there as Commissioner for Emergency Services in Canberra at the time, and we were supplying resource into Brisbane, and I was up at the press conference, standing in the back of the room, and she was asked about the circumstances that the citizens in Brisbane were going through, and she shed a tear in the process. And I talked to her about it about 3 months later when I had a chance to talk to her. And she said, Mark, I didn't see that coming. And she was so moved by the suffering of her citizens and what they were going through and experiencing. She was so moved by the response by emergency services and related institutions that she shed a tear. She was incredibly moved by that. And that's when she secured the trust of the community. They realized she was human. To realize she wasn't just saying the words, that she was authentic. She had compassion and she had integrity. And I saw the mood shift substantially in community, and the government made the connection with the citizens. It was extraordinary. Shane Fitzsimmons being in the fires in 2019, 2020, and reflecting upon the deaths of the firefighters that he lost on the fire ground, he couldn't help but be moved by the circumstance. And people listened to what he had to say. They were really great examples of relationality and, one to many, the one to many. In my book, I talk a lot about symbolism, sentiment, and data. And how do you motivate, or how do you connect to many people when you're one person? Look for the stories, look for the symbols, look for the story of one that represents the story of many, and understand the sentiment of that story. Not so much about what people are thinking, but how are they feeling. Seeing, sensing, and feeling is really important. So who's the symbol of the one that represents the many? Tell their story. What's the sentiment of that story, or what's the sentiment of the symbol? Make sure that's in the story. And then what does the data have to say about it? If we don't understand the symbolism and the sentiment, then when we look at the data, we'll see the wrong picture. We'll see the wrong thing. Data is there to support, not to direct. So I tell a story of a US governor who was in front of an audience of about 300 people on social policy issues around children with severe disability, and essentially the parents would die before the children, and the children would be left in the care of the state. They'd become wards of the state. And the parents weren't happy at all about the circumstances in which the kids would find themselves, and they voiced this to the governor in no uncertain terms. And he said, look, I don't have children with disability in my frame of reference. It's not part of my experience. He said, but I want to learn and I want to understand. So he said to one particular citizen, he said, how about if I give you 5 days of my time and come and live with you? Will you show me what it's like to live with a child with disability and how you raise them? And she said yes, and he did it. This is a governor of 24 million people, and he goes to family for 5 days to actually understand and to profoundly understand what it is they're going through in order to change the policy settings. So there's some really good examples in the book, but I've seen them in my career. Another minister said sometimes we just need to sit down and talk to people in order to understand what.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, in terms of that practical approach, and to Juliet's question about compassion-led recovery, I guess some other ways of thinking of that are, when we're talking community-centered recovery, when we're listening, when we're engaging with those impacted communities. I guess that's a compassion-driven approach as well, you would argue, Mark?
It sets up the basis for it, absolutely. If it's community centered, so it's not community led, because sometimes they're not in a position to lead, and I think community led can be an abrogation of the system itself. It's not that it should be mutually shared, is my very strong view. If you've got an ethic of compassion in that community centered proposition, then absolutely you're lining two things up. So you need that framework, because the ACT government just wrote a community centered approach to recovery and relief and recovery. I think it's one of the best frameworks in the country at the moment, because it puts the citizen in, but the institutions join the citizen in the journey. And I think that's the secret to success in community-led recovery and a compassionate-led recovery framework, is it's citizen-centric, but it's government and community sitting side by side. So problem definition and problem solution are mutually negotiated, using ethics such as compassion, courage, and wisdom to shape, to guide, and to lead through that direction. I think that's the ethics that sit at the heart of it. So you've got the framework that says citizen-centric. That's the framing. We know what that looks like in our governance frameworks. The ethics that you bring to the table in that citizen centricity is compassion, courage, and wisdom. If you bring those three things into the space, I think you've got the recipe for when I say success, the experience being otherwise more pleasant than it otherwise would be if we didn't take that approach.
Thank you, Mark. And I've just turned my video off because I think I'm glitching a little bit, so apologies for that. But I do want to come back to some of those themes in terms of, with our comms and engagement professionals in the room, and I guess some practical advice around, and I know in your book you touch on, and you mentioned earlier, the importance of symbolism and the importance of narrative, which I think will be of interest to a lot of people. But I'll just come back to a couple of questions on the Q&A first. We've got one from Vaughan Brandenburg. Hi, Mark. I've enjoyed reading some of your articles on moral superiority and hypocrisy. For me, it felt pertinent to the increasing polarization across politics and communities. Further to what you've already discussed, can you speak to the steps that we can take at a system level to ensure our decision-making fosters cohesion, mutual understanding, and open discourse?
Yeah, I think it's how would I best answer that? I think it's a way of being in the world. I think when the polarization, let me put it to you this way. I talk about this in the book as well, that we all sit between 0 and 1 in all circumstances. So you might find that the events that we go through and the causes and conditions for that event could be unique to the world, but our experience of that event is not unique. It's a shared experience. So we all sit somewhere between 0 and 1. And polarization would convince you of the opposite. Polarization would say that you're either with us or you're against us. You either understand or you don't understand. And that's what polarization does. The reality is we're not at 0 and we're probably not at 1. We're somewhere in between. And what does that space look like? Well, that's the relational space of understanding. So we have to seek to understand and contextualize the problem that someone is expressing and try and navigate mutually beneficial solutions to that problem that's being presented. So it's a contextual and a contingent process. So it's not like there's 6 steps to happiness, for example. If we follow these 6 steps, it'll work. It's more complex than that. It's about saying, what does my lived experience taught me about such circumstances? How can I relate to the suffering that's presenting here? Can I relate to it? Can I see it? And can I do something about it? And what narrative or language or communication do I need to exercise in order to shift this thing in the right direction? So it's not so much about doing things to people, it's about doing things with people and centering it on this notion of understanding where is the vulnerability and suffering, what does it look like, how do I relate to it, can I relate to it, and what might I do about it personally, and what can I do about it institutionally. The equities of power, wealth and resource that I have available to me in terms of my institutional position, how can I use those as best as possible and leverage them as best as possible to alleviate this circumstance? So it's a mental process. It's a mindfulness process essentially. I hope that's making sense. It's sort of
Yeah, look, it did to me, and sorry, go on.
oh no, I was just going to say
Go on, Mike.
someone in the chat talked about um, how ego becomes a barrier, because I think that's part of the answer to this question. Ego is principally driven by excessive amounts of self-interest and self-importance to the neglect of other people, to the neglect of the needs of others. And that is in philosophy the root cause of all human suffering. When we neglect the needs of others and put the needs of ourselves ahead of everybody else in a self-interested and self-important way, and excessively so, then suffering flourishes. And you can take that as a universal principle and a truth. It is absolutely true. It's the greatest. It's the greatest impediment of the human ego, that it just puts itself above everybody else. And the minute we do that, we fail to consider the needs of others, and they suffer accordingly. So if we're mindful of that, we've got half a chance of doing something about it.
Hmm. Thank you. A lot of wisdom and good thoughts there. And Vaughan said, yes, that makes sense. Great. I was going to check with you there, Vaughan. And I think in connecting back to Juliet's question too, I'd see you're from New Zealand, Juliet. I'm sure you've got similar principles, but the national principles for disaster recovery in Australia link quite nicely to some of what Mark's talking about in terms of, recognizing complexity, working with communities, doing with rather than doing to. And a lot of those principles really are a compassion-led approach as well. Really keen to hear if others have examples of where that's worked well in Australia or New Zealand as well. Please feel free to pop something in the chat, or if there's a link to a report or a study that anyone wants to share, that's always really welcome in the chat as well. I think we've got another question pop up here from Barb, and apologies, Barb, you might need to clarify, because that question was asked a few minutes ago in terms of contesting some of those ideas. But if in the meantime, I might just come back to that comms specific one around in your book, which I was scanning over the last couple of days. I was interested in your reference to the importance of symbolism and the importance of narrative, which obviously a lot of comms professionals beyond this call, and a lot of the work we do is around symbolism and narrative. And if you could maybe just flesh out a little bit around that, how that can be useful in driving a compassionate approach.
Yes, Jeremy. I think Mother Teresa would say that if I look at the masses, I would never act. If I look at one, I will. There's a question about, can you be compassionate to more than one person at a time? The data would suggest that on a logical and reasonable and analytical approach, the answer would be no. We're not moved by numbers alone. So we look at the deaths in Palestine, for example, and Gaza, and we're horrified, but we're not necessarily moved. It's hard to see action. Not saying things aren't happening, and I'm probably opening up a Pandora's box, but when we see massive numbers of people, often we're aggrieved and distraught at what we see, but we don't know what to do. So the way to move to action is to actually tell stories. And I come back to this question, this notion of symbolism. Martha Nussbaum, who's a female philosopher, talks about tragic narrative, and the tragic narrative is to really find the sadness and the suffering and the vulnerability and speak to it. Speak to the truth of the matter. Don't gloss over with rhetoric and defensiveness and insensitivity, but speak to the heart of the issue. What is actually going on? Tell that story, and then what can be done about it. So in my book, I make the point that nature will put us in a position where not only citizens are vulnerable, but so are governments and leaders. We all enter a space of vulnerability in a different context. We have to, one, accept that that's where we end up, and two, we have to share that space and tell the stories about what it's like to be vulnerable. So and then not only what it's like to be vulnerable, but as a government and a leadership, what are we doing about it? What can we actually do about it? So the storytelling is fundamental, Jeremy, and I've said this for a long time, that good communications professionals and good leaders are first and foremost storytellers. What's the true story that's happening? What's the human story that's unfolding in this crisis that needs to be told? And how can that guide and direct action and prioritization and so on and so forth. Because without that, we resort to our frameworks, we resort to our policies, which are utilitarian, which are principles driven, which are fine in the purposes for which they're intended, but can't be contextualized. They often miss the point. Here's another really brief example. I think it was in 2014, I got called up to Parliament as Director General over the fires in Tasmania, and I was relayed a story by one of the senators. The Tassie Fire Service had done a great job of protecting a local tourist centre in one of the wilderness areas, and had done a good job and thought they'd done a good job, but the community was pretty angry about it all. And when the senator asked, why was that so, they said, look, people didn't come to the community for the tourist centre; they came to the community for the forest, for the wilderness area. That's why they turned up. Now that it had been burnt out, the tourists wouldn't turn up for 5 years, and that story hadn't been told. The story wasn't understood. So understanding notions of value and what's important to people it comes out of the storytelling. So if we can really get to the heart of the issue, what's important to people from a value proposition, it's stories that help us get there. And if we can listen to those stories and contextualize them, then we start to make changes about how we respond, and we start to make changes about how we recover.
That's great. Thank you. That's really good advice. Conscious we've probably only got a few more minutes, so last call for any burning questions. Please pop them in the Q&A for us. And I'm just looking at, we chatted earlier before about the EMPA principles, and for those of you that aren't familiar, you can find them on our empa.org.au website. But I'm interested in a couple of them and how they might cross over. And I think one of the ones that you talked about in terms of us being all leaders in different ways, and how we might influence the leaders above us and around us with some of these principles. And our very first principle with EMPA is the seat at the table, with communicators needing to be a voice and a presence in that strategic decision making, which in some organizations easier said than done. But often communicators and engagement folk are bringing that wisdom, are bringing information from the ground, and often have that. And ideally, you've got leaders who are listening to that. But how, I guess, we try as communicators to ensure that we are in that strategic space and not just creating things afterwards. And I guess being a part of spreading that compassion-led approach as well. I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts or advice around that seat at the table and how best to do that?
Absolutely. So as a communicator, you have an obligation to represent the feelings and the interests and the sentimentality of the citizens that are being affected by the crisis, or will be affected if you're in the preparedness phase. But I think it's also important to see what is it that concerns the leadership. So where is their suffering place? What is it that they're concerned about? What does harmfulness look like for them? Because it'll be a little bit different. And can you bridge the gap? Can you access it with your narrative? Can you meet the needs of the leader and address their concerns at the same time as addressing the citizens? So you become like the connecting piece. So it's not just about advocacy for the citizenry into the system, it's also appreciating where the leader's coming from. And look, even if they're egotistical and, or worse, they're still going to have needs, and they're still going to have fears, and they're still going to have concerns and sufferings. And if you can see that and link it up to the citizen in some way, shape or form, this is the contextual and contingent aspect of what I'm talking about. There's no recipe for this. It really is about human experience and insight and being mindful of circumstance. If you can bridge that gap or make that linkage, then you will have influence, I promise you. I've been in strategic leadership since 1998. And sometimes the most profound wisdom has come from the people who know how best to communicate, how best to tell, how best to represent the feelings of others. So look at both ends of the spectrum. Look at what's concerning the citizen, what their needs are, and then look at the needs of the leadership and see if you can bridge that gap through your narrative and your story. The symbolism of the one representing the many and the sentiment of how they feel about it. And I think you find it moves most people to action in the right direction. And that's all you're trying to do, is move the agenda in the right direction. you're not going to get a perfect solution. It's not possible. Life doesn't work that way. But the direction is where we're heading here. Is it in the right direction? Is it heading down the right pathway? I think that's the existential question.
Yeah. Thank you. Mark, we've probably got time for two more questions, which are in our chat window. So one from Angela Draper. Mark, could you please talk about bringing the practice of reflection into our busy workplaces?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Life is so hectic. It's just outrageous, really. I mean, how much of it is really important is a different question. I think it's worthwhile, even if you just take 5 minutes a day to reflect, have a reflective practice, or have some sort of. I talk about this in the book as well about having ritual. Rituals are really important, and reflexivity is a part of that ritualistic approach to life. Adversity teaches. There's no doubt about that, and you can't get the lesson when you're in the. And get the lesson at the end of it. So if life is about lesson, if life is about growth, about becoming whole and complete, then adversity is an important part of that. And the adversity can be really subtle. It could just be your boss ignored you for the day, or it could be your house burnt down in a forest fire. I mean, the possibilities are endless essentially. But being reflexive of circumstance and asking the profound or existential question, what is the lesson here, or what am I learning? Once your mind is ready to ask that question, it's worthwhile asking. I think it's a really, really interesting way of turning something that looks awful into something more positive. Dark clouds have silver linings. So reflexivity I think, is a fundamental part of leadership. And I think putting ritual around reflexivity is really important. It can be a daily practice, a weekly practice. You can do it on your holidays. I'd say the more often you do it, the better off you'll be. But just understand and know that adversity or difficulty is not just suffering. I mean, it is suffering, but it's also a lesson and learning. It's also, excuse me, helping to develop character.
Thank you, Mark. Great advice again. I'm sure we could talk to you all day and glean more wisdom from you. But let's do one more question, and that's from Andrew Blades. And that's, Mark, do you have any guidance for how you balance the needs of a single community with whole of society needs?
Yeah, that's advocacy, I think, is the best way. If frameworks are properly set and established, they should have enough room within them to be contextual and contingent. If the framework's too rigid, and I think this is the problem with some governments and their policy making, particularly if the policies have been insensitive to need, or if there's been any invulnerability in the policy making or policy advice. I remember, for example, the Queensland disaster resilience strategy in 2014 was really, really hard on citizens. Toughen up Queensland essentially, or harden up Queensland, or whatever the terminology was. Put a lot of pressure on citizens to be a certain way. I think people really buckled under that pressure and found themselves not found themselves wanting, but were seen to be found wanting because they couldn't meet the government's high quality standards of resilience. So I think the frameworks need to have enough flexibility in them and enough contingency to allow that contextualisation to happen at the local level. If that can't happen, if the frameworks are too rigid or too insistent, or if that pendulum of responsibility, shared responsibility, is too far in the quadrant of the citizen, then it's going to be extremely difficult. And my book talks a lot about that, Jeremy, about that being problematic. And it also talks about how to swing it back again, which I think is this question about participative democracy. So how do you sit down with citizens and share the problem definition and the problem solution? So the governments are really good at defining problems, apparently, and then talking to communities about how to solve them. But often communities will say, but that's actually not the problem. The problem is different. And governments often can't hear that because they want to maintain control. So they maintain control by controlling the problem statement and then seek to work with communities to solve it. And it often marks. So I think the approach is to say, before we get too far down the road of defining the problem, can we sit down and talk about that? And what do we think the problem really is? And then we can talk about some solutions about how we move forward collectively. Now that takes time and patience, and it's probably counterintuitive to our systems that insist on answers almost immediately all the time. Ministers want today, not tomorrow, and maybe we've got to say the whole thing needs to slow up a bit. You can see how complex this is, can't you? I mean, these are really good questions, and clearly your audience is well engaged on the subject matter and right in the thick of it. And I think hopefully the book can give them some insights and some parameters about how to think differently and how to come at these problems differently without necessarily following rigid steps along the way, which are likely to fail because even those rigid steps won't be contextually contingently relevant in most circumstances, I would suspect.
Mm. Well, we're almost up for time, Mark. So I think we'll pause it there. But thank you again. I'm sure there's a lot of people on the call that perhaps you might be able to post a link, actually, Mark, to your book where people might be able to buy it. I understand it's available at most booksellers and Amazon, etc. But if you are able to pop a link in the chat, that might be helpful. And some of you might want some of your leaders to also see it. So maybe you can get your organisations to purchase it, or just get a little early Christmas present for a leader that might need a bit more in this space. But really appreciate the insights and observations. Thank you to all of you for being online and for the questions that you asked as well.